So this is the next video in my Chicago history series, and I'm going to get around at some point to uploading all those. There's like 15 of them, the previous videos, and putting them in a playlist on this channel. So this video is going to be about a mayor of Chicago in the early part of the 20th century who went by the name Lil Lincoln. And this guy's name was William Thompson. And he was a very interesting and controversial figure, and the political landscape back then was a lot different than it is now. Back then, before, the dissemination of media to the extent that we have it today, and before the internet, and before, everybody had a TV and a radio and all that kind of thing, there was a lot more stuff going on back then that really people couldn't do today. Business could be conducted in a way back then that really couldn't happen today with the level of public scrutiny. Everybody's got a smartphone recording everything, every single thing that every politician says at every minute. Even private meetings gets uploaded to social media and talked about on Twitter and stuff. Back then, this was a whole different world. And so the public was kind of at the mercy of the facts that leaked out and got to the press media, the newspapers, which sometimes could misconstrue things, sensationalize things, but word of mouth played a much bigger role than it plays today. Word of mouth being literally one person to the next. So I'm just kind of setting the stage for how we have obtained, some of the facts about the things that went on during this particular time period with this mayor man. But this guy was very interesting because the racial landscape of the city at that time was a lot different than it is today. This is before the civil rights movement. So at this particular time, the Republicans were considered to be like the pro-black party. Okay, very different from, the way that things are popularly looked at today. You got to remember Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So black folks, by and large, supported the Republican Party. And the Democrats were seen as the party of the KKK and the party that was racist against them. And so in Chicago, running as a Republican mayor meant you were basically siding with the black community. And you have to remember, at this particular time, we're talking like the early part of the 20th century, black folks are coming up to Chicago in large numbers. Still a pretty small percentage of the population of Chicago at this point. We're talking like 1915, but they're growing at a rapid pace, okay, coming up from the South. You got to remember, we're looking back on what happened at that particular time in American history in hindsight. Hindsight is 2020. A lot of the people who were coming up from the South at this point either had been slaves themselves when they were kids, or their parents had been slaves. And there was no guarantee at this particular time that slavery wasn't going to come back. Okay, that, the people in the South weren't going to try to do that again, or that it wasn't going to just be reimposed in some more subtle and subversive form. You still have, obviously, even to this day, you have, human trafficking and slavery of that kind, but I'm talking about like on a mass scale in a way that, might not officially be called slavery the way that it, was prior to the 1860s, but still practically for all practical purposes be that. So it was a lot different though once they got up here than being some, land of the free, obviously, because they came up here and they're in this urban industrial environment, okay, where the vast majority of people are employed in these kind of factory jobs. And these whites in the North are not the same as the whites in the South. These are like whites that are fresh off the boat from Europe. They have their own problems, their own conflicts, their own beefs from back there that they're bringing over here. These whites are like dirt poor working in these factories. And these whites are doing something that, the whites in the South were not doing, which is gang banging, right? I mean, they have their organized crime families. They've got their street gangs. And every neighborhood in Chicago at this point pretty much is controlled by some gang. Not only that, but the politicians are connected with these gangs. And a lot of the politicians at this point, especially a lot of the Irish politicians, are former gang members. Okay. And if they're not former gang members themselves, they've got family that are in gangs. I'm talking, this kind of a thing was much more overt than it is today. And I would say much more prevalent. Like Lightfoot and, Rahm Emanuel and these guys, they don't really have like any gang ties. But back then, the mayor, this particular mayor, especially William Thompson, Little Lincoln, he had ties to Al Capone and the Mafia. And so, the black folks, they're coming up here from the South into this environment and having to like totally readjust from the way things were back in the, in the Dixie South. The reason that I'm setting it up like that is to show that a lot of the way that historians portray guys like William Thompson is a bit dated. Like, they're looking at it through the lens of the way that we view politics today and the way that we would see certain actions that these politicians took in this day and age. Back then, I kind of disagree and take issue with the way that a lot of these historians like view the stuff going on back then is particularly corrupt, because back then this was like business as usual. So anyways, William Thompson, he was a Republican, and he was first elected mayor in 1915, and he was known as a progressive, on racial issues. So again, black folks at this particular point were still by and large Republicans. So William Thompson appointed a black assistant corporation counsel, and he handed out a lot of jobs, a lot of patronage jobs in an area of Chicago that was known as the Black Belt. In the black neighborhoods of Chicago was where he first got the nickname Little Lincoln, because of how progressive he was on racial issues and how much, he was doing for them as far as giving out jobs in the black community and, appointing black people and trying to basically give them an advantage in city politics that they hadn't had before before he got into office. So in the white neighborhoods, this was not popular, because white folks, at this particular time in Chicago, and really, to some extent, even to today, but way more back then, were in political competition, in street competition, and in competition for jobs with black folks. It was like, and not only with black folks, but with each other. Like, each white ethnic group was competing with the other white ethnic groups for all these pieces of all these different pies: jobs, political power, power in the streets, the illegal hustles, the legal hustles. It was like one big ethnic gang war basically in Chicago at this particular time, and black folks were just one more group, fighting amongst these other groups. So the people who were obviously against them, they were like, this is not cool the way that he's helping them out. And so they referred to his particular city hall as Uncle Tom's Cabin. The black folks were supporting him, and this rubbed a lot of whites in Chicago the wrong way. They were supporting his reelection. I'm talking about like the black voters at this time. And some historians attribute that support to being one contributing factor to the race riots of 1919, which I've already done a video on, so I'm not going to go back into that. William Thompson, he also had another nickname, which was Big Bill. He was a big guy. He was 6 feet plus in height, which back then was really tall. People back then were shorter. Nutritional advances and all that kind of stuff have made people taller today, but back then that was big. And he weighed over 300 pounds. But they also called him Big Bill because he had an extraordinarily flamboyant personality, according to historians. And so he referred to himself as a cowboy. And at one particular point, he actually rode a horse into a city council chamber. Now, during the First World War, which had, was taking place around that time, he took the side of the Germans against the English. And this was a very controversial position to take at that time, because the Germans obviously were, they were seen as the ops, right? In World War I and World War II, the Germans were the ops, and there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in America at that particular time. They were referring to Germans openly by like these disparaging ethnic slurs, like in newspapers and stuff, and people were very much against Germany and the Germans. The same way that you see a lot of xenophobia every time there's a war, like against Arabs or Iranians, for people that remember, like back in the 70s and 80s. Every time there's a war, Russia with the Cold War, you always see a lot of, discrimination and bias against people from that ethnic group that are from that country that the U.S. is having a conflict with. Well, at that particular time, it was Germany. Okay, and Germans were not considered to be like these classic white Americans the way that they're looked at today. Back then, they were like fresh off the boat immigrants, and people were looking at them as, a threat. They were also a threat because, they ran the booze by and large. I mean, they had a lot of the breweries for the beer. Okay, and so actually the prohibition movement to ban alcohol largely was like an anti-German movement. Like, let's cut off the revenue from the money that these Germans are making off of all this beer. Thompson, he was siding with the Germans. So he was siding with basically everybody that the majority of like white Americans were against. Black folks, Germans. And so the people that were against him nicknamed him Kaiser Bill. He couldn't run for re-election in 1923 because his campaign manager was implicated for shaking down a school supply vendor for bribes and political contributions. And this is according to historians from NBC5 Chicago. So he withdrew from the race in that particular year because of corruption in his campaign. So by him getting out of the race, though, his Democratic opponent, whose name was William Deaver, he won. Okay, and that was basically like a guarantee for him to win with Thompson out of the race. Thompson eventually, though, got back into it, and he was like keeping his name in the headlines by pretending to organize an expedition to locate a, quote, tree-climbing fish in the South Seas. So this is the kind of like flamboyant, extravagant, this outlandish stuff that he would do back then. He would take these positions that like nobody else would take and do these things that nobody else would do. So he's saying, we're going to go to the South Seas and we're going to find this tree-climbing fish. It basically just kept his name in the media, in the press. And sometimes these kinds of things enable a person to maintain their voice. Just anything that gets attention can keep a person relevant. So at any rate, in 1927, you guys know the prohibition of alcohol was a thing, okay? And the sale of alcohol was taken over by the gangs in Chicago, by organized crime. And so the gangs were at war at this particular time. Now we're talking mainly Irish and Italian gangs. Al Capone's gang, the North Side gang, the Irish, with the O'Banion guys, and then, they changed leaders several times. Thompson was known as somebody that was in favor of alcohol sales, okay, and being pro-German was part of that. So beer was very popular in Chicago. Like, Chicago had a big ethnic European population. These people were Catholics. So alcohol is allowed, for Catholics. A lot of Protestants don't drink alcohol, but Catholics do. Okay, Catholics and Orthodox, like the two older churches of Christianity, they allow alcohol. I think a lot of Protestant churches do not. And that was a big controversy back then. But Thompson was taking the side of those who wanted to allow alcohol. So he promised that Chicagoans were going to get their beer. Now, the Deaver administration, and I'm quoting here, they said, has made one of the greatest records in Chicago's history for closing up businesses, according to Thompson. He said, when I'm elected, we will not only reopen places these people have closed, but we'll open 10,000 new ones. That's what he said. That's a direct quote. So when he said the word businesses, what he was really talking about was speakeasies. And for the kids watching the video, a speakeasy was like a place where you could go to get booze during Prohibition, okay? So Al Capone, the head of the Italian organized crime in Chicago at that particular time, the head of the Chicago outfit, Mayor Deaver had been against Al Capone. And he had actually kicked Al Capone out of Chicago to the suburb of Cicero, which is just to the southwest of Chicago. Now, Cicero today is predominantly Mexican, but back then, it was European. But Al Capone, when he saw that Thompson was going to run again against Deaver, he was hyped, okay? And he actually put up a portrait of Bill Thompson in his headquarters. I'm talking about Al Capone did. He had a portrait of this mayor, and he gave at least $100,000 to William Thompson's campaign fund. And back then, guys, that was a fortune. 100 grand in, the 1920s, that was a lot of money. Okay, so Thompson returned the favor by appointing one of Al Capone's own agents, a guy named Daniel Saratella, as the sealer of the city. At this point, Al Capone had like eyes and ears inside of City Hall with one of his own guys inside, the government. So Capone, he expanded his headquarters to a hotel called the Metropole, and he set up his gambling operation 1 block away from City Hall. So 2 historians that wrote a biography of Bill Thompson said, quote, Capone was strong and growing stronger by the day, and his City Hall friends looked on and stuffed their safety deposit boxes with money. Now Al Capone and the Mafia had their people inside the city government, and this connection with Al Capone, a lot of times historians look negatively on this. I would have to agree that, that's a negative thing when you've got organized crime with people inside the government, but at the same time, back then, this was something that was very difficult to avoid. Like, I'm realistic about how difficult it was back then to stay out of that, So I'm against it, but at the same time, I'm not as judgmental or condemning as some historians might be. And the last term that Thompson served ended in 1931, really. A guy named Anton Cermak, after whom 22nd Street on the south side is now named. He campaigned against Thompson, and the thing that he was really campaigning against was the connection that Thompson had with Al Capone. This was like it was like an open thing politically. Like, this guy is, connected with the Mafia, and so Cermak was running basically overtly against that alliance that he had. Now, Cermak was a Bohemian immigrant, and he was basically mocking this fact. And this was a bad move, okay, for him to mock immigrants because there were so many immigrants. He called him, quote, pushcart Tony, okay? It totally backfired. Like, as a political maneuver, dissing the fact that he was an immigrant completely backfired. It was like a big gaffe back then, because, everybody was coming from these, like, rural, communities back in Europe, and now he's dissing him along those lines. And, so Cermak just, seized that opportunity and came right back at him. He said, quote, he doesn't like my name. He said, it's true I didn't come over on the Mayflower, but I came over as soon as I could. And Thompson lost. Still had a lot of money, though, even after he lost power. After his death, he left $1.5 million in 2 safety deposit boxes. Okay, so $1.5 million back then, again, was a lot of money. So this is kind of a short episode, but it just goes to show how some things change and some things stay the same. I mean, they say the more things change, the more things stay the same. But today, in 2022, I don't think a Chicago mayor could really have the kind of open, alliance with the Mafia that he had back then. If that type of a thing was to take place, that would be something that you would have to do everything you could to try to cover up. And if the media got a hold of that, that would be like a deal breaker as far as like politics. But back then, politicians were doing that, and the negative impact that this had was that it sent a message to everybody coming here that, like, the streets is a way to get into politics. Okay, Larry Hoover even talked about this, like, overtly. He was saying, like, these other ethnic groups, they start off in the streets and then they transition into politics. So this is what we black folks have to do. But you see, like, times have changed. Today, a lot of politicians are not starting that way. Lightfoot, like, she didn't start off in the streets. I mean, the next mayor after her, whoever it's going to be, Raymond Lopez, for example, who's running as, like, the anti-crime candidate, this coming election, he's, like, vehemently anti-gang. I mean, he's like the gang's, like, number one op. I mean, his stances are unambiguously anti-crime, anti-gang. Like, he's constantly ripping on gangs and all that kind of stuff. Anybody that follows him knows what I'm talking about on any of his social media accounts, man. So, yeah, today, I'm not sure that the connection with organized crime could really fly the way that it flew back then, man. But like I said, it got a lot of guys looking to that as a way to get into the legitimate business world and into politics. And it created really like the gangster culture that we have today, because everybody that was trying to get anywhere in Chicago, went to that and started off in the streets. And, it turned the place into a bloodbath, where kids can't walk to the park. It really had an effect that the people who were originally trying to get into politics so they could, help everybody else out and help their people out and all that kind of stuff, it backfired. Because, okay, well, you've helped out a few people, maybe like your immediate family members, and gotten them some positions and some money and stuff. But the ethnic groups that a lot of these people came from lived in war zones, that like they were trying to then get out of, when these places could have been peaceful and low crime had, everybody just done things the legitimate way. But that wasn't the way that people chose to take it. And a lot of this culture was brought over from Europe, really off the boats. But it just continued right over here. And, Chicago could be really a lot nicer and a lot more prosperous than it currently is if things hadn't started off that way. I think that culture really took it down a dark path that really, even to this day, we have yet to get off of. So you guys let me know what you think in the comment section, man. But that's my little piece on Bill Little Lincoln Thompson. Your boy Winnie C. Report. I'm out.